Welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me as he always does is Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Bob, great to see you.
We've talked about the situation in Ukraine. We've talked about the West's response to the annexation of Crimea by Russia. One of the biggest tools that's on the table so far that's being used, sanctions.
Yeah.
What's been done and what do we expect happens next?
Yeah, almost by default, Bob, we're now in the field of financial pressure and warfare. Diplomacy has its limitations. Physical force, kinetic force, military power limitations, and frankly is not going to be used here to push back the Russians either out of Crimea or on the Ukrainian border. So we're in the space of financial power and influence to try to change or deter the calculus of what's happening in Moscow. What has happened to date is that the European Union and the U.S. have put out a number of names tied to sanctions related to the instability in the Ukraine, as well as going after Russian officials, to include inner circle officials around Putin, for the actions in the Ukraine. This is significant because I think it is in some ways the opening salvo of trying to not only punish but also isolate elements of the Russian economy and key actors, to include oligarchs, in a way that will hurt Russia in the long term. The challenge here, though, Bob, as we've said before, this is not a silver bullet, and these types of sanctions, especially the kind that isolate financially, aren't going to have an immediate impact, and so it's not going to stop Russian troops from entering into Ukraine tomorrow. But it can impose real costs on Russia, and I'm happy to explain how that might work.
Let me ask you this. So these sanctions, I mean, to some people they look tough, to some people they look weak. Do they have any real impact, or is mostly this about sending a message? I mean, how much damage can these sanctions do?
They have multiple effects. First is they can have diplomatic, sort of symbolic effect, right? Look, we're designating inner circle of Putin's elite, for example. You can no longer have a bank account in the West. You can't travel to the West. There's visa bans. That's not insignificant in some ways, right? But that's manageable. The longer term and more important impact is, what does this do to the isolation of Russia's economy and markets? You've already seen its stock market hurt, the value of the ruble drop. You've started to see, and I've heard this in my own conversations, started to hear questions on the part of Western companies and investors as to how they're even going to operate in Russia with this level of uncertainty around what's going to happen.
Not what's happened so far, but what could happen.
What could happen, right. And keep in mind, capital is a coward, right? So it will flee places of conflict and instability if there's a chance there's going to be a problem. Things like assets being frozen or financial warfare back and forth. And so money that was going to be invested in Russia, you know, maybe that goes to Turkey.
How significant is it that a bank was targeted? That the U.S. made a point of saying, we're also going to sanction this bank.
Yeah, this was incredibly significant. And we forecasted this when we said, look, the measures that are going to be taken are not just around the oligarchs or individuals, but around the businesses, and particularly the Russian banks that can be implicated in this. And this particular bank, 17th largest bank in Russia, has correspondent relationships in the U.S. and Europe. That means that's now going to be blocked. They are cut off. They can no longer do business with the West. That's devastating to a bank that wants to do business globally. They can't deal in dollar transactions, which is the reserve currency of the world. So that bank is basically now a pariah in the international system. Can't really do business. The other important thing was, this is controlled by Putin's inner circle. This was a bank that was used by elements of his inner circle. So it sends a very clear message.
That's personal.
That's personal. Very clear to Putin and his cronies that your ability to finance things and to do business in the West, you may laugh it off now, but this is going to hurt a week, 2 weeks down the road, and down the road you're going to be unable to do business the way you have.
As we wrap this up, you said laugh it off. It seemed like Putin was laughing because after the new sanctions were announced, he slapped sanctions on people here like Senator John McCain.
Yeah, I think the Russians are sending a clear message. Look, we can two can play at this game, right? This is not just something the U.S. can do. We can do it as well. The difference is, and you saw this in Senator McCain's funny tweet in response, you know, the reality is Russia's much more vulnerable to this kind of financial isolation because they rely on the West much more and their ties to the global economy. The Russian bear can bite back, and I've made this clear. I've written pieces on this, but the Russians are much more vulnerable long term. The challenge is not to overstate the immediate impacts, which I think the administration got into a bit of problems with, but you will see if they continue to hit banks, companies, arms merchants, things that touch closer to the heart of Russia's economy and inner circle, that's going to bite.
We'll have to see how this goes. Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.